Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Reach. Today's episode, you don't look autistic.
Ah, that dreaded phrase of "you don't look autistic." That that is a phrase that I have been told in my lifetime, Conrad. And let me tell you, when I have heard that phrase and I've been told that phrase, it takes a lot out of me not to say, "Well, should I perform an autism for you?" Because that's so mean. Like that's a mean thing to say.
And the other thing to ask is, what does autism look like?
Exactly, exactly. It's like, those people who say like, "Oh, you look normal." Well, what does normal look like? Your definition of what autism and what normal looks like are going to be different across the board.
And it's a spectrum for a reason. There's different traits that exhibit in different people at different varying qualities. And sometimes it's not entirely invisible, which creates undue bias. And sometimes it's so invisible that there was a study published in 2023, Journal of Autism, that 1 in 14 don't get diagnosed because of it, because they mask so well.
That makes perfect sense. And I believe the rate in girls is actually much less than in boys for that reason. Girls tend to mask autistic traits more. They're able to sort of mimic what their environment looks like and what other people do so that way they can ultimately fit in. So that's something that I know as a female who is has autism, I've experienced that and I know a lot about that just having been through that myself.
And those that create this undue judgment of like, you don't, in either sense, it creates this lack of understanding where they don't see what goes on underneath. They don't see the struggles that we deal with, the burnout that we experience, and the days where we are just done.
I like to compare autism like an iceberg, right? So with my own autism, you might see, that I might have some anxiety on the surface, and you might see me talk eloquently and present in a way that is easily understood. But underneath it, I am dealing with burnout, sensory overload, auditory processing issues. There's all of these underlying things that are going on inside of me that no one can see. That's how good I've gotten at masking my own autism.
Yeah, iceberg is a good analogy for it. It's just like, yes, you're like holding it steady, you're there, but like underneath everything is just brewing. You're keeping track of, okay, this body language, what do they mean by that? Okay, I got to keep track of this later on because did I do a social mishap and I got to punish myself later for it because I'm like, oh no, not to mean to punish myself, but just to like go over and over in my head saying, okay, how could I have done this better? All these things are just constantly going on and on and on, but can't show it.
Yep. Oh yeah,
Got to
exactly.
camouflage.
Yeah, because if you even begin to hyperfixate on what's going on the outside, you start to become more obvious. Oh my goodness, there's something wrong with this person. Oh, they're perseverating, they're saying this, they're fixated on this idea of you doing this or saying this or looking this way and acting this way, and then it just spirals.
And in other extremes of like not looking autistic, like still very appreciative of the movie Rain Man, how Rain Man brought some awareness to autism and set a standard for Hollywood, but because of it, a lot of people when they think of autism expect that.
Oh,
And no, not everybody who is autistic is a mathematical genius or a savant or is obsessed with trains. Like,
yeah, it's very true. It's very true. Actually, kind of speaking of Rain Man, so I'm going to go into a little bit of a personal narrative for a moment because this brings me back to when my parents were divorced. My dad actually said when he was under oath about how like he treated everybody growing up that I with my autism remind him of Rain Man. Now, if you get to I love how your face is like, wait a minute, are you serious? Because in all actuality, even like if you get to know me even for say like 10 or 15 minutes, I am nothing like Rain Man. I do not do the mathematical, I'm not the mathematic genius. I used to memorize phone numbers. I used to memorize nicknames and middle names and addresses, but I was not a mathematical genius in the sense of being anything even remote to Rain Man. So it just goes to show you that there's this misinformation about autism that's spread. Autism in mainstream media was not represented accurately back then. That's one very small portion. But that being said, yes, Rain Man was very obviously autistic just based on his own behaviors and his own stems and his own things that he was going through in the movie.
Precisely. It created this box that, like, okay, autism equals this. And that's like saying the color blue is specifically this one particular hue and nothing else is blue. No, there's millions of blues.
There are people that, quote, may look very painfully, and I say this in air quotes, autistic just because, they might do something that is in line with what autistic symptoms may look like. For example, repetitive behaviors. You see a person who's, shaking back and forth and rocking back and forth. They may be hand flapping, they may be scripting a TV line. These are some of the things that, I have seen in my daily work as a behavior analyst, but also some of the things that I used to do growing up too. And between that, communication, some kids or some autistic people might have harder times with executive functioning, you know, but it's very different across each and every single autistic person. So to say autism is Rain Man, autism is this box is just completely blasphemous, in my opinion.
It it's wrong, but it creates this sense of, okay, now we know what autism is, so we don't have to go any further. It's like, no, how about why they are doing this? Why are they stimming? Because if they're stimming, usually a reason for it.
Yeah, there's always a reason. I know personally in my own life, I actually will start talking to myself and have full-blown conversations with myself. I had a roommate that I used to live with that there was one time where I did talk to myself and have a full-blown conversation. And as a way to put me down, she actually decided to record me having a conversation with myself and send it to my old best friend at the time. And it was so interesting because it just goes to show you that, like people don't understand that there's many different facets to autism. When you meet an autistic person, you're meeting one autistic person. You're meeting one person with autism, as opposed to meeting everybody in the community within one person.
And meeting that person, we it doesn't mean you should meet us and go, "Oh, I'm so sorry for what you're dealing with."
Yeah. Don't.
No, how about learning what we deal with instead of feeling sorry for us, and then how about helping us find a way in society? How
Yeah.
about welcoming us? How about going, okay, I see this environment might be overstimulated. Hey, turn the music down. Like, okay, be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, show compassion is free. For example, I know that, some of my friends can't handle extremely overstimulating environments like a basketball game. And a basketball game has a lot of different sensory components going on. Loud noises, bright lights, flashing lights, lots of people. I know personally, for me, I'm able to handle those types of crowds and those types of situations, but not every autistic person can. And usually, what we find a lot of times is autistic people are quote unquote known to not be able to handle those types of environments, but that's actually not true necessarily, you know? That's why it's really important to ask those kinds of questions. How do you feel about this? What makes you feel comfortable? It's just like getting to know somebody for the first time and developing a friendship, whether or not the person is autistic.
Going that extra step just means so much more.
It's interesting too because it takes really getting to know that person and really getting to see, what they really are like. That's why it's important to know that when you're meeting one person with autism or one autistic person, you're only meeting that one person. you know um Come to us with questions, come to us with compassion and kindness. We're just like you, we just have this added layer of ourselves.
We're happy to divulge and share as long as you're willing to actually listen and
Exactly.
go that extra mile instead of the superficial. Okay, we're neuro inclusive.
What does that mean?
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
does that mean you just want me to be there, or that you want to show everybody else that you want me to be there?
And it's funny, kind of looking back at the you know, you don't look autistic phrase. I remember going to a store and I remember talking about, the fact that I was buying materials for some of my clients because I'm a behavior analyst by trade. And I was telling the cashier about how, the materials that I was getting was to create something for one of my clients. I work with autistic children for a living. And I was also talking about my own story of having autism. And, they didn't necessarily say the words, you don't look autistic, but they did ask me if I was misdiagnosed. And so it's just like, yeah, I see you rolling your eyes because it's true. It's so true because it's like, it just goes to show you that you, I know it. I know what you're
I've had so many different reactions. When I got my diagnosis, it was kind of figured,
saying.
or but you communicate well.
Or you don't flap your hands, or you don't do these other things. And it's like, just because I don't do these things doesn't negate my diagnosis, you
Yeah,
know?
maybe some of those behaviors were drilled out of me when I was younger.
Exactly. It's called society punishing those behaviors.
Yeah, nope, not acceptable. You can't do that. Stop.
Stop that, or we're going to make fun of you for the next 16 years. It's like guys, come on now. So I ended up actually spending that time educating her about why, autism is not just this one particular box. Yes, people who will flap their hands, yes, people who will script, um they might be autistic, but at the same time, that's not the only example of autism. And we don't want you to come to us and just say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about your condition. I'm so sorry for you. Like I feel so bad." No, just be compassionate, be kind, ask us questions, include us. And when we say include us, that doesn't mean just say, "Hey, come over here." It's actually like finding ways to accommodate us to be included.
Yeah, and please don't go as far as saying it's a condition.
Yeah, please. It's not a condition.
We
It's
are who
not,
we are.
yeah.
We would just like the world to be more accepting of it.
Exactly, exactly. Being autistic is a huge part of my identity. And, just because I may in my case, I may be more eloquent in my speaking, or I may, be able to present myself as quote unquote neurotypical according to some people. That doesn't mean that my identity is invalid. You know, Being autistic is a huge, if not probably the hugest part about me, and it's important to embrace that. It's important to acknowledge that and accept that
And celebrate it.
and celebrate it. Yes, exactly.
And for everyone, whether you speak elegantly in quotes or way you communicate, all communication is valid. All communication should be accepted. As
Exactly.
someone who teaches communication, it's amazing how many people I've worked with are floored by just being able to communicate with just body language. What I teach goes from making sounds with just your vocal folds and nothing else to actually working all the articulators. We do everything in what I teach. And like to show people that yes, you can still communicate. It's
Yeah,
just not what you expect communication to be.
exactly. Exactly. Working with a bunch of different learners myself, I've worked with people who speak, people who use a speech generated device. I've worked with people who use picture exchange, gestures, all of that, all of those modes of communication are just as valid as anything else, you know? And so it's important to validate their communication and not just that, but be understanding of their communication. I've worked with some people who sign, and, again, every form of communication is valid. It's important to understand and accept and celebrate that. Whether the person is able to present in front of 5,000 people or a person is just engaging in hand flapping and rocking back and forth in the corner.
Absolutely. And people need to take the time to patiently listen, not just go, okay, yeah, you're going on a monotropic tangent. Show some interest, please. Like,
Yeah.
we're not doing information exchange not for nothing. We love doing it. Sure, sometimes you might have heard it like for the 20th millionth time, but a gentle reminder, okay, you've already told me this, but humor us sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like, it's okay to tell us, hey, I listen, you've already asked that, or you've already told me that, or that's really cool. I know you mentioned that recently. Come in with a place of compassion. We're not just trying to annoy you or bother you or, make you feel uncomfortable. We actually are trying to communicate with you, and we want you to care enough to communicate with us too.
And in that communication, take the time to, like I said, really listen, because sometimes when we communicate, we're not going to mimic the same communication style of what you're presenting, which does create problems.
Yeah.
And there are studies currently being done about this. It's really interesting research, but it hasn't been fully published yet.
I think really just the biggest point is, autism does not have one look, it does not have one style, one behavior, one mode of communication. Autism, we're told it's a spectrum, but the thing is, when it comes to that spectrum, there's different levels of supports and there's different levels of need that we need to look at, you know? How do they communicate? How do they go about their day-to-day life? Are they able to independently engage in like specific tasks? Or I'm speaking in behavior analytic language, I apologize. But I'm thinking a lot about like, how are they able to live their life the best way? And I think that's the most important thing here is, autistic people just in general, I feel like want to live their best life.
And not just live their best life, but feel like they belong.
Yeah, exactly. Feel like they belong, feel like they deserve a space at the table. You know, we really just want people to not just acknowledge our existence, but accept and celebrate our existence too. Well, thank you everybody for tuning into this month's episode. Next month is Water Safety Awareness Month. So, on next month's episode, we'll be talking about water safety tips. Looking forward to talking about it.
Can't wait. Good time to do a splash.
Yes, very that.
Thank you all for listening. Till next time.
Till next time. Bye, everyone.